What's going on, everyone? I am Tim Berzins, and this is Amplified Vitality. Welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to be discussing how you actually lose fat on a high-carb diet. I get a lot of questions about this because obviously you're eating more glucose, you're stimulating insulin, you're not burning and not eating as much fat. So then how do you actually lose that fat? The answer is actually pretty simple, but there's a lot of mechanism and insight that we can kind of go into. You all have been asking for whiteboard videos, so I decided to get a whiteboard. And so we're going to have fun with this. We're going to do all these images and insights and mechanisms to talk about. This is going to be more than just this one video because we have a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss. We're going to be also going through things like the carb-insulin hypothesis, calories in, calories out, metabolic flexibility, sort of understanding how all these come together because they're interrelated concepts. I think not all of them are completely right, but they're also definitely not completely wrong. There's all these different data points and different understandings from these theories that I think all kind of can help to paint the bigger picture and the constellation of things that we can start to understand how this applies to us so that you and your nutrition can actually be emboldened by the things that I'm going to be talking about. And maybe decide what your carb level intake will be and how that makes sense based on your diet and the things that your body is going through in the physiology, the state of physiology that you're in. So we got a lot to discuss, and we're going to dive right in. So hope you're excited and hope you're ready. So to start out, we got low carb up here, and we got high carb down here. So tissues, I drew muscle just because muscle's where a lot of the glucose gets disposed. Muscle's also where a lot of fat gets burned. Liver would also be included in this as well because the liver processes a lot of fat and also stores glycogen. Other organs, also are involved, but for now, I just put tissue. We have the adipose tissue, and we have the incoming nutrients. We're going to go through all of this, and it's going to make a lot more sense. So in the low-carb state, we have 0 grams of carbs, 150 grams of fat. 0 grams of carbs is not 100% practical in the real world, but it is possible. Some people do that. But the main point of this is just to show that you have a lot of fat coming in with minimal carbohydrates. Whereas on the high-carb side, we have 270 grams of carbs and 30 grams of fat. So I never really put fat at 0 because you do need some fat in your diet. It is an essential nutrient. Glucose, while it's not essential, doesn't necessarily mean that eating more is less healthy or that you don't need to eat some. Eating it does have hormonal effects, and it does help to boost the metabolism and boost respiration. So there's a lot that's important about eating glucose. But for comparison's sake, we're going to be using 0 carbs, 150 grams of fat for the low carb condition, and then 270 grams of carbs with 30 grams of fat for the high carb condition. And within this, I'm also assuming that protein is equal on both sides. Protein is the only nitrogen containing macronutrient. That helps spare lean tissue. It has its own effects as well. Changing the protein intake between two different groups can very much change the outcomes because of that. So we're going to assume that protein is the same between the two and just go with these numbers as far as fats and carbs go. Now, interestingly, these are actually the exact same number of calories. 150 grams of fat versus 270 grams of carbs and 30 grams of fat, same exact calories. So you'll notice that 150 grams of fat, this is 300 grams total. So it's double the content, the actual volume of content, than in the high carb condition than in the low carb condition, which goes to show how high carb diets can actually be pretty filling and can actually help add more material that your body has to digest. And that can be part of a benefit in fat loss, assuming that your physiology is aligned with that. In addition to this, you're not only getting double the amount of actual material, you're also getting 810 grams of water, something around there, for this amount of carbohydrates to get stored as glycogen. Not all of it will get stored. Some of it will get burned off immediately, and some very small amount will get turned into fat via DNL. At this level, that's not going to happen to any huge degree. Maybe if it was all pure fructose, and I talked about the amount of fructose in another video recently that I see as like the healthy range where most of it gets converted into glucose, lactate, some of the other organic acids. But if you're eating 270 grams of pure fructose, which no one's doing and is not even natural by any means, then potentially DNL could go higher because that has to get processed by the liver. And if the liver gets overburdened, then it will turn some of that into fat. Under most conditions, unless you're really massively overfeeding carbs for multiple days in a row, DNL is going to be minimal. But in this case, DNL would be carbohydrates getting turned into this total fat coming into the system. So, which actually maybe this arrow should be over here, so because it's not really coming in from the fat, but we're gonna keep moving anyway. So let's kind of describe this condition in the low carb state. That's the traditional way that people understand how fat loss happens. They understand that when you're eating less carbs, you're eating less insulin, or you're getting less insulin production. Insulin blocks adipose tissue. So this is this low insulin state. You're eating this fat. Some of it is immediately going into the tissues and getting oxidized. This is fatty acid oxidation. Fatty acid oxidation goes up when you're eating more fat and fewer carbs. Insulin stays pretty low unless there's some sort of derangement, and this is going to be something we'll talk about in a little bit. So some of this fat's getting burned, but fat is very easily stored, even in very high fat conditions. If you're overfeeding on fat, it doesn't need to be processed. It doesn't need to be converted to anything. It can just literally go from the diet right into the adipose tissue. So we talk about how burning fat is important, and that's why we want to have, in the low carb condition, have low carbs and eat more of the fat. But the problem is that more of that fat is actually going to make its way into the adipose tissue, even without insulin, because it's just very easily stored and you aren't going to be burning it all off. The big difference is that when fat gets stored into adipose tissue, it then has to be pulled out of adipose tissue via lipolysis. Now, the fat that you eat and the fat that you burn from adipose tissue is fundamentally different in the process that it goes through. The fat that's eaten, it gets absorbed as something called chylomicrons, which are these big protein bubbles that allow the fat and the triglycerides to safely and freely float within the bloodstream. Fat and water don't mix. Our bloodstreams are mostly water, and so having all that extra fat, it's not going to gel well. It's not going to be able to float on its own. So it needs to be packaged in a protein bubble. These chylomicrons, they're a little bigger than the VLDL molecule, but they're very similar. The VLDL is also a protein bubble that safely transports fats. VLDL is produced by the liver, which I don't have written on here. The liver will take in free fatty acids from the blood, repackage them into VLDL as a safe method of transport, put those back into the blood. VLDL and chylomicrons are both absorbed and digested by tissues via the action of lipoprotein lipase. It's basically the enzyme that breaks down these protein bubbles and allows the contents, the fat, to enter into the cell to be used for building purposes, to be burned, even converted into cholesterol to be able to use for steroid synthesis and a bunch of other stuff in the body. But the main point being that those protein bubbles are different than the free fatty acids that are released when you have to release them from adipose tissue. Free fatty acids are released and bound to albumin in the blood and float around, but these are very metabolically active, unlike the VLDL and the chylomicrons. This is sort of analogous to like free testosterone versus bound testosterone. And a lot of those hormonal tests, people will be very concerned about the free level of the hormone because that is the bioactive amount, the amount that your tissues are actually able to have bind to the receptor and have those physiological effects that we want. The chylomicrons and the VLDL, they do not have nearly the effect that the free fatty acids do as far as bioactivity goes. So in the low carb condition, more fat coming in, some of it is burned via chylomicrons, but the rest of it's going to go to the adipose tissue. And then because insulin is low here, then more lipolysis is going to be allowed to happen. Now, more lipolysis means more free fatty acids in the blood. And more free fatty acids in the blood, these will go into the tissues and they will get burned. They will go into the liver and get burned or repackaged as VLDL, as I said. And then that VLDL will come back into the adipose tissue. The big issue here, though, is that in order to get the free fatty acids out of the adipose tissue, you have to rely on stress hormones, adrenaline being the major lipolytic hormone in the body. And so you kind of see as the adipose tissue being the trap almost, that if you put fat into this, then you have to pay the cost of some sort of stress in order to get it back out. And so this would make an argument for, let's put less in here to begin with so that we have less of a need to activate stress to get it out. Now, I will say it's not always just about stress. There are some other factors that do help to burn or to release fat from the fat stores. Different lipolytic agents, for example, growth hormone, which is not necessarily a stress hormone, has a lot of different functions in the body, but that actually does increase lipolysis as well. And during sleep, when growth hormone rises, this is actually supposed to be a good thing because it helps to supply fat for the blood, for all the tissues during sleep when your liver's going through the detox and all that stuff. So it is important that you have that growth hormone for that lipolysis. And obviously, when the growth hormone comes at sleep, you're not supposed to wake up from it. You only wake up if you had to rely on the adrenaline in order to do so. Another one would be thyroid stimulating hormone, or even just the thyroid hormones, active T3 or the inactive T4. Those also can create lipolysis, and those are not going to be doing it through the stress action. But more importantly, those actually sensitize the cells to adrenaline. So because the cells are more sensitive to adrenaline, you need less total systemic adrenaline in order to get that same lipolytic effect. And so you're actually lowering the amount of stress required to get the free fatty acids out of the adipose tissue in the first place. So blood levels of the free fatty acids rise in this low carb condition because some of the fat you're eating is getting burned, some of it's going to the adipose tissue. Low insulin and higher adrenaline is going to stimulate more lipolysis, increasing more of these free fatty acids. That adds more free fatty acids to the blood. It means the liver has to process more of these free fatty acids and repackage them into VLDL. And we actually find that, I mentioned in a recent video, that even in certain starvation states, you can see fatty liver start to develop. And the reason is because in those fasted starvation states, your adipose tissue is exposed to lots of adrenaline and you're just dumping free fatty acids in the blood. The cells will respond to that and the tissues will take it up and they'll use that for fuel. But because the levels are so high, the liver has to process so much more of the free fatty acids. Not all of it can get exported into VLDL, especially in a starvation state. You're low in things like choline and methyl groups like TMG. So you're going to have a harder time exporting that fat. Some of it gets stuck in the liver, and that's where fatty liver starts to develop. And this can even be a little bit of a protective function because in a starvation state, you're actually trying to slow things down. And that's kind of where I'm going with some of this with the fat, is that the action of fat kind of is a little bit more like a brake and it slows things down. And part of that is from the liver fat. Part of that is going to be from increases in reactive oxygen species. So fat, when it's burned, actually creates more reactive oxygen species. These are basically the free radicals, the electron stealers from the electron transport chain in the mitochondria, which is the last factor within respiration. And so if the mitochondria have a lot of reactive oxygen species, they are going to start degrading the ability to produce energy. As we've talked about so many times on this channel, respiration in the mitochondria, that ability to create fuel from that higher order function, so important for so many things. It's the efficient use of fuel. It actually allows all of your cells to get the energy that they need to perform the functions that they want. It is only when the body senses low energy and it's not able to respirate properly that energy levels start to drop. And then stress hormones come on to try to limit the extraneous functions, right? We don't need to reproduce if we're under stress, if we're starving, if we're running from a lion. We don't care about reproduction. We don't care about having good skin health or immune function, because those are all longer term things. We want to just try to survive whatever the stressor is. And if we don't have enough energy, that is a stress on its own. So we want to take care of our mitochondria. Burning more fat is necessarily associated with more reactive oxygen species because more reactive oxygen species are produced when fat is burned. This is even worse if you have a very high polyunsaturated fat diet. I don't think all polyunsaturated fats are necessarily bad. Again, the question is, are you burning them or are you using them as building blocks for prostaglandins and eicosanoids and all these other kinds of things? So there is a use case for certain polyunsaturated fats. We'll get into that in another video. It's too much for here. But the majority of your fat intake, if it's coming from saturated and monounsaturated fats, then reactive oxygen is going to be definitely lower in the mitochondria. But then on top of that, making sure that your antioxidant status is good, that can actually help to protect that as well. So we have all these free fatty acids. Oh, another really important point here that I think is worth mentioning is that burning free fatty acids or burning the fat itself is not necessarily associated with impairments in mitochondrial respiration, assuming that there's not an excessive amount of reactive oxygen species. However, if the cells are surrounded by lots and lots of free fatty acids that aren't necessarily being beta oxidized through the mitochondria, the presence of the overflood of free fatty acids around the cell and around the mitochondria actually does disrupt the membrane, and it actually does slow down the mitochondria. So high exposure to free fatty acids without a concurrent increase in the beta oxidation of them, meaning that they're not actually getting pushed through the chain to be turned into energy, that can actually slow respiration. And that is a huge problem that we see in those stress states associated with high free fatty acids. Now, within all of this, we're talking about how bad that can be. This is the high fat flux state. This is where there's so much fat going through the system. There's fat coming in, tissues are burning fat in the mitochondria, it's getting stored and then coming back out as lipolysis. The liver has to handle it. There's higher lipotoxicity potential in the blood. Tissues are burning more fat. More of it's getting reesterified as well, because any excess free fatty acids released in the blood, they're not just going to float around. Their tissues are going to start taking those in, the liver and the adipose tissue. And you have to rely more on the stress hormones. Having said all that, this is not a non-viable situation. This can work if you do it in the right way, specifically making sure that your beta oxidation remains high, that your reactive oxygen species remain low through proper antioxidant supplementation, that you are releasing more of the free fatty acids in adipose tissue through non-stressful ways. So either sensitizing yourself to adrenaline so that you don't need as much of it, or making sure your sleep is really good so that growth hormone is there. There are some fasting strategies that increase growth hormone as well, so that could be another way to approach it and look at it. But in this higher level video, we're not going to go into all those details. But that's kind of like the low carb condition. Now, the high carb condition, there's actually a lot of benefit that we can get from the high carb condition, but it's not as simple because sometimes carbs can interfere with the whole fat burning process. So let's come back down here and talk about this. So in the low carb condition, we have low insulin, but here we have cyclical insulin. You notice that I didn't say high insulin. The reason for that is because even if we're eating a lot of carbs, the insulin is not just chronically staying high. Carbohydrates stimulating the insulin receptor, or stimulating the release of insulin after a meal, will actually come back down. And so you have, insulin comes up, insulin goes down, insulin comes up, insulin goes down. There's a little bit of this like pendulum swing type of thing, this diurnal pattern that I think is really important for physiology. It's the same idea as, daytime and nighttime, sleep-wake cycles, fasted and fed. There's these two different states that you want to be able to freely swing between. And this actually touches more on metabolic flexibility, which is a huge part of this conversation, and it's probably going to be the next video I do. But for now, we're going to keep going with this high carb condition. So when you're eating more of these carbohydrates and just a little bit of fat, fatty acid oxidation from after the meal, from the meal, is going to be reduced in the tissues. You're not going to be burning as much as many fatty acids in the tissues because insulin will be higher coming in with those carbohydrates. If your insulin sensitivity is really good, if your body's able to take up glucose very easily, so for example, like after a workout, the contraction of a muscle, and especially repeated contractions like in endurance training, that actually causes the same receptor that insulin activates, the GLUT4 receptor, to come to the cell, surface of the cell, to take in glucose. And what that means is after a workout, if you eat glucose, you don't necessarily rely on insulin to push glucose into the cells. The cells already have the expression of that GLUT4. They will take in the glucose from the blood right from the workout. So here, this 30 grams of fat, it's not going to be going into tissue because of that high insulin and because your body's burning carbs preferentially. Carbs are the preferred fuel source. It would rather burn carbs than fat. And so you're burning more carbs and you have a high insulin state, which is also stimulating glucose oxidation and glycolysis, along with glycogen synthesis. So glycogen synthesis is happening, and this 30 grams of fat pretty much is going to get stored right as adipose tissue. So this is where this carb insulin hypothesis comes in. Because we have carbs coming in that's stimulating insulin, any fat we eat gets stored as adipose tissue, and lipolysis is reduced. So from a very basic perspective, it's like, okay, well, we're burning less fat and the fat we eat gets stored. Therefore, carbohydrates are making us fat by blocking the fat. It's not that simple though, because everything exists on a spectrum. The high carb condition, you're not completely not burning fat. And then in the high fat condition, you're still also burning some carbohydrate as well. And in fact, some of the tissues in the body, like the brain, parts of the heart, and parts of the kidney, those all require glucose. So you are always burning a little bit of fat and a little bit of glucose at the same time. But in metabolically flexible people, the ratio of your diet will reflect the ratio that you burn, which is the respiratory quotient, the RER. So the amount of carbon, or the amount of oxygen consumed for the amount of carbon dioxide produced, determines between whether you're burning carbs and burning fat. And that tracks very well in metabolically flexible people based on the diet and what you're eating. And this is going to be a huge point too that we're going to come back to. So this fat is all getting stored as adipose tissue. But remember, it's only 30 grams of fat. In this condition, we had 150 grams of fat. And while some of that's getting burned, some of it's also ending up in adipose tissue. But in this condition, the lipolysis is high because the carbs are low. This one, lipolysis is going to be lower. And that's because adrenaline is going to be lower. So that means even after the fact, the tissues are still going to have reduced fat oxidation, fatty acid oxidation, and you're going to have reduced free fatty acids in the blood. You're also going to have a little bit more of the re-esterification, which is what helps to lower those free fatty acids in the first place. But at the same time, less reactive oxygen species. Carbohydrates are also better sources of antioxidants, typically. Excuse me. So you're going to have less of that reactive oxygen species in general. And so that helps protect mitochondrial function and also the reduction in the free fatty acids. Beta oxidation is lower, so you're burning less of the fat, but there's less fat available to be around the cell in the first place. So you're not having necessarily that down regulation in the respiration you could have otherwise. So this is the low fat flux. This is less flux in the fat system. This has a lot of fat going through it. Fat coming in, fat getting burned, fat going in the adipose tissue, getting released in lipolysis, going in the blood, the liver repackaging it, putting it back, re-esterifying it into adipose tissue. Just a lot of movement of fat in this. And too much fat, as we've seen, can clog the system, can create some issues. The high carb, you have so much less of a fat flux. There's not as much fat going through the system. There's less fat coming in. There's less fat coming out of adipose tissue. And so you're relying much more on the carbohydrates. The benefit of the carbohydrates is that they help to stimulate the metabolism a little bit more than the free fatty acids do. And most importantly, they do so outside of a stress state. So going on a keto diet or fasting can short-term increase metabolism, but it's doing so through the increase of the catecholamines, through increased cortisol. It's increasing your metabolism in the short term. It's not necessarily increasing it in a healthy baseline kind of way like carbohydrates do. So in this state, you can see that it's less fat coming in, but there's really not a lot of fat coming out. How do we actually lose fat? Well, this would be a representation of how it is. Same amount of fat loss in both conditions. Here you have 150 coming in, but 215 grams getting burned. So the actual flux, net flux of the adipose tissue is down 65 grams of fat. This is the amount that you need to lose 1 pound a week. You have to lose 65 grams of fat per day, essentially, to lose 1 pound of fat per week. In this condition, it's the same 65. It's just that now you have 35 coming in and you're only burning 95. Now, you might be wondering, how do we burn 95 if we're not able to get any out of the adipose tissue? Well, again, it's not an all or nothing thing. This is always a spectrum. This is only 270 grams of carbs, which for many people with 30 grams of fat and let's say adequate protein would be in a calorie deficit. And this is actually where the calorie model does apply pretty well. If you're able to make sure that the total energy coming in is less than the total energy that you're putting out, then your body's going to have to rely on fat burning because it doesn't have the carbohydrates coming from the diet. It has enough to help sustain. It doesn't have so much that it's actually completely blocking this to the point where this number starts to go down and then that number starts to go down. So it's still about balance and still about making sure that you keep things in track. The advantages of this one is that there are less free fatty acids, better thyroid support through having the carbohydrates and the glycogen, better performance in the gym, because you need carbohydrates, you need glucose in order to perform really well, to be able to do strength or endurance activity. And while fat on low carb, especially like on a keto condition, while your total fat oxidation can ramp up and it can actually get pretty high once you're fat adapted, you're still never going to get that super high octane ability that you can get with carbohydrates. It's just not fast enough. It takes way too long for beta oxidation to happen in order to produce the amount of ATP needed to fuel high intensity work, whereas glucose can do it real quick. And even if it can't get respirated, it can still produce energy through glycolysis alone, which is where lactic acid production comes in and all that other stuff. So we can see that the fat loss is similar between the two conditions. There's advantages to both, and some of those advantages will be practical. So, low carb, eating a lot more fat, while I said that the higher carb condition, you're getting more total volume, and that total volume of food can be pretty filling, that assumes that you're able to process or process carbohydrates and produce insulin properly. If you're in a metabolically inflexible state or an insulin resistant state, then this insulin might just stay high the whole time. And so it's going to be a lot harder potentially to be consuming carbohydrates in that high insulin state. Not because this total amount. If you were actually able to eat this total amount and still keep, the calories in the appropriate place, it might be a little more grindy because that insulin isn't responding like it should, but you would still end up having to burn that fat, and it would still end up coming off the body, and then insulin sensitivity would improve over time. But in those people, there is an advantage to doing a lower carb diet where total insulin's lower because that's the hormone that you're least responding to. And if we can get fatty acid oxidation to go up enough that we're actually able to burn off some of the fat, especially the fat that's laced in the tissue that's actually slowing things down, then we can start to speed things back up again. Now, I don't see the low carb condition as a long-term approach. I see this as a short-term approach. And remember what I said, there's this pendulum swing of the cycles, the day and the night, the fast and the fed. Low carb is essentially a fasting mimicking diet. So would you want to mimic fasting all the time for your entire life? Probably not. But fasting and the fasted state has a lot of potential advantages. One of them is you don't have to rely on insulin. So if you are insulin resistant, doing something lower carb could be potentially helpful. It also can increase or can make you feel a lot more full. Fat actually does stimulate GLP-1. And again, in this low carb condition, like I said with the lipolysis and adrenaline, if you're able to actually do it in a proper way that reduces the amount of stress, make sure that you're not getting an overflood of free fatty acids, slowing down respiration and preventing respiration because it's not actually being oxidized, it's just hanging out around the cell, creating some of those intermediate byproducts like the diacylglycerols and things like that, the like half oxidized products, and the ceramides from saturated fats. Those can be really bad for metabolism. So assuming that you're not doing that, assuming you're not relying too much on stress, and assuming you're taking care of your antioxidant status, this can work and it can be very helpful for people. And again, in the short term, I don't think that this should be something that is a lifelong thing. Some people do it. Some people seem to thrive on low carb, and I'm definitely not going to deny that evidence that there are some people who really do well on it. But I've also worked with way too many people who have the negative consequences of this, which is too much stress. If it's not set up properly, whether it's just for your physiology or whether the diet that you're following isn't set up properly, you're going to be releasing too much stress. Free fatty acids are too high, much more lipotoxicity potential. You're going to be getting much more liver fat. The liver is going to slow down, become more resistant to insulin. Then it's going to be converting amino acids into glucose because it's not hearing the signal from the insulin that is present. You're going to be high fasting blood glucose levels. I've seen it time and again on people who've done low carb diets for years on end, and I think it's just it can be a real problem. This is also where the slow metabolism comes in. So again, this is a nuanced take on this because the low carb approach, it's not an all or nothing good or bad type of situation. It's something that you have to really understand what's going on in the body to understand whether you're in a healthy low carb diet or whether you're in a stressful low carb diet. And we just got to kind of figure that out and balance that. So this can be really helpful, but for a lot of people going too long with it, you end up relying too much on stress, putting too much fat in the blood, and increasing your reactive oxygen species. Not good. On the other side, if we consume carbohydrates, and carbohydrates typically have fiber in them, and if they have fiber also stimulates GLP-1. So, I said that fat stimulates GLP-1, so does fiber. So fiber can also be helpful there. Insulin is also a hormone that that helps to reduce appetite if your cells are responding to it properly, and especially if you're actually turning this glucose into energy through respiration, then that can actually help to lower your appetite as well. But again, this is a unique or an individual physiological thing. Some people, when they start to eat carbohydrates, they just get hungry and they just want to eat more and more carbs, and they aren't able to stick to this number. And so the behavioral part of this, the psychological part of this, is not separate from the physiology. If your cells are still starved when you're eating carbohydrates because they're not really processing it properly, and your insulin is chronically high and you're not responding to it well, then you're going to be more hungry, you're going to want to be eating more. Why not go to a diet that doesn't rely on insulin if you're in that state? burn off some fat, and then come back and reintroduce carbohydrates. Totally an option. However, there are the advantages of the high carb as well. Like I said, you're not relying on stress hormones as much. You have less of the reactive oxygen species. You're supporting thyroid, you're supporting leptin. All of these are very important as well. But again, at the end of the day, if you're trying to lose fat on a high carb diet, it comes down to the total fat flux. Are you pulling more fat out of the fat cells or out of the adipose tissue than you're putting into it? And that's the big question. And this one is a high flux. You have to burn 215 grams of fat in this scenario in order to get the same fat loss as only burning 95 grams of fat. And again, since fat doesn't produce as much carbon dioxide, and because fat has the potential, if it's not completely oxidized, to create all these issues that we talked about, and because carbs have a lot of benefits for hormones, for leptin and thyroid, this can be a better option. This places less burden on the body in order to burn all that off. And it also helps to perform the function better. If this carbohydrate increases your total calories out more because it's able to actually support that respiration and support higher energy and higher activity, then that can be a really healthy long-term thing. This can also do that through the action of the stress hormone, but you don't want to do that for too long. Otherwise, you're going to fall into that adrenal fatigue burnout that I talked about last time. So I think with all of this is probably a good place to leave it because this video is getting a little bit long. The basic answer of how you lose fat on a high carb diet is that you're still eating less energy than you're burning, and then your body eventually has to still tap into those fat stores even though it has the carbs. And the low carb condition is the exact same thing. If you're eating the right amount of carbs based on the total amount of calories, then the total insulin response is going to be lower. So while something like the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis says that you eat carbs, it creates insulin and it blocks fat burning, therefore carbs make you fat, we're still talking about total amounts. We're still talking about this spectrum of just shifting fuel sources within a spectrum, not in a one or the other type of thing in a dichotomous way. So advantages to this one, advantages to this one. I do think that the high carbohydrate is a better baseline diet, or at least moderate carb, right? So the brain and the heart and some of the parts of the kidneys, they only use about 130 to 150 grams of carbs, like I mentioned. And so this amount would help to supply all the needs of the body. You might not get some of the performance benefits of having higher carbs, but if you're in a weight loss phase, that means that you're going to be burning more of that fat while still taking care of the lower stress hormones and on all that stuff. And so, we like to be really extreme and say it's either super low fat and high carb or super high carb or super high fat and low carb. There's an in-between, and the in-between actually can be very satisfying. You're getting plenty of good fiber from the carbohydrates and enough carbohydrates to help with the performance. You're getting enough fat to support your hormones and to help with GLP-1 as well with the fiber. It's also a lot easier to eat enough protein when you're adding in enough fat. Doing a high carb, low fat, higher protein kind of approach, you're eating lean meats, everything's really dry. It's not really that good. Whereas if you're adding in some of the fattier meats, then those are just naturally easier and helpful for getting in that protein. So from a behavioral standpoint, that's important too. We can also talk a little bit more down the road about, bile acid. So like if you're eating fiber and fat together, the fat increases bile acid production, fiber binds it and takes it out, helps with detoxification, helps with cholesterol synthesis and all the stuff, and even help with reducing fatty liver because the liver produces the bile acid. So lots of stuff to talk about in the future going on here. I think this diagram is a really good starting place to just kind of help give you guys the picture of what it looks like from a physiological perspective, from like a mechanical, mechanistic perspective. Again, what it's going to come down to at the end of the day, what makes you feel the most full? What gives you the best energy and the best sleep? What helps your performance in the gym the most? And then the biggest question, are you actually losing weight on it? If you find that you lose weight better on one or the other, then maybe your system is more geared towards that. And again, don't get dogmatic with this. It's not like one is the correct way for all humans to eat and one isn't. We're all individual and there's a lot going on here. I don't want to deny anyone's experience. And if somebody is doing really great on a pure keto diet, more power to them. I also know a ton of people who are doing great on high carb, very, very low fat diets. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of inter-individual variability. And you just got to trust your own experience and treat yourself like a scientific experiment, and also be objective with it and make sure that you eat more carbs one day and you get all this extra water weight coming in from the glycogen. And so in the first day, the scale goes up and then you freak out and you're like, oh, I'm gaining weight. I have to cut carbs again. Well, did you really gain weight, or are you just adding more glycogen into your system, or food stomach contents because you have more fiber and stuff like that? A rational scientist approaching the N=1 experiment of the body, they wouldn't freak out about that. They would give it enough time to regulate and to normalize, and then compare and contrast based on how they feel, whether their energy is good, and all this other stuff. So I'm going to leave this one here. Thank you guys for listening. Again, I know lots of information in this, but hopefully the physical diagram actually really helped you to piece it all together and put the pieces of the picture and the constellation starting to crystallize a little bit more. I'll be back again really soon. Again, I want to talk a little bit more about metabolic flexibility, because there's some interesting things about the ability to switch between fat and carbs and whether you can do that adequately. If you can do it really well, there's a lot more benefit to it. But if you can't, then there are some strategies to do to help mitigate some of that. So we're going to be diving into all that very soon. If you like this video, or actually if that sounds interesting to you, please hit subscribe, because then you're going to be able to keep up with new videos that are coming out. Make sure that you like this channel, like this video, and share it with anyone who you might think would enjoy it, or would like this mechanistic understanding of how fat loss on both low carb and high carb works. And leave comments below so we can continue the discussion as we always do. I also have an article for this video going to be on my Patreon, link below, so go ahead and check that out. And I think that's all for today. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you for tuning in. I appreciate all of you, and I love that we have this ability to form a community around these kinds of topics, that I get to teach you the stuff that I've learned that I find so exciting and valuable, and to help you with your nutrition journey as I explore deeper levels of my own nutrition journey, and just the science and the literature and the mechanisms and all that stuff. So really appreciate you all. Thank you. Talk again soon. Peace.